You're listening to Creative Voices, a new podcast about creativity in music. Each week I talk with composers, teachers, and performers and ask them to tell their stories of musical creativity. Today you'll hear from Northwestern University professor Vasily Biros and his experience as a 21st century composer writing music in an 18th century style. To start, here's an excerpt from Dr. Biros' 2013 Fugue in B minor.
I'm Vasily Biros, Associate Professor in Music Theory and Cognition at the Beaton School of Music, Northwestern University. I publish on music of the long 18th century, taking perspectives from music theory, music history, music cognition, and I fancy myself a period composer. The idea is to not try and mimic any one composer from the past, but to try and reconstruct a kind of larger musical culture in order to find a voice within that time period. In the same way that presumably one would have found a voice back then, even though they're picking things up from their contemporaries, you're kind of developing your own identity within that climate. And I think that's one of the reasons why this whole enterprise gets kind of misunderstood. When people talk about period composition, they think, oh, I'm trying to compose like Mozart or like Beethoven or like Bach. But the idea is more along the lines of trying to find myself or someone else finding themselves in the past, finding a voice in the styles and musical languages of the past. So it's a complex project because it involves reconstruction, issues of identity. Why is it you want to identify with something that's effectively dead? People who are interested in this kind of thing not only model the music on the music of the time period, meaning the musical models, but also the process, what we know about the creative process, the pedagogical process in the 18th century. So there's a kind of dual modeling happening. You're using the actual musical models, whether we're talking about large-scale form or local-level phrasing, but also how they approach creativity or composition. We know, for example, that some of the greats, Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, started with pre-given materials. It was hardly ever this kind of pure ex nihilo construction. An example I always love to give, because it really gives you a sense of what composition was like in the time period, the Bach C minor Passacaglian fugue. The subject that Bach uses for the Passacaglia in the fugue comes from another composer, André Raison, although Bach does extend it some, and the extension is itself telling. But Bach's voice is not really to be found in the melody, if we understand the melody as a subject, but in this edifice that he constructs. So he's clearly taking something from another composer, but then building this gorgeous monument out of it. And it's just one example where they're constantly taking pre-given materials. Mozart's Requiem, I don't even know if we should be calling it Mozart's Requiem anymore. Half of it is Handel, the rest of it is people who completed it. But still we sense Mozart in there somehow, rather than Handel or Süssmayr. So this idea of starting from pre-given materials as a kind of starting point, problem-solving activity, inspiration, whatever the initial impetus might be, that's part of the process. And then, of course, the idea that we're constantly learning from models, even in the time period. Everything was exemplar-based. In terms of teaching music, it was almost always by example. You want to learn how to do this? Here's how to do it. Here's 20 ways how to do it, 30 ways how to do it, and you just kind of abstract from those exemplars. A connection I like to make in my sophomore theory class, which is kind of predicated on this period composition idea, getting them to compose or fill the shoes of historical composers. The main connection is jazz and pop music, because it's highly conventional, it uses licks, and Mozart and Bach were not all that different. Joe Madden, Cubs manager, tells his players respect 90, meaning 90 feet. I say respect 90, referring to the 90% of my listening diet. That's all I listen to. So from the time I was about, 20, 21, 90% of my listening is music from the long 18th century. So it's sort of this kind of immersion tactic. It's not only because I enjoy the music, but I always viewed it as a kind of an aspect of compositional training, just immersion, being saturated with that stuff. And it's interesting, I often see in the creative process when things come out more instinctively, it's almost always a reflection of what gets most reinforced in terms of my listening. So you hear these like Bach, Beethoven hybrids coming out, because if any two composers fill up the majority of that 90%, it would be those two. I think that is also an element of creativity, right? This idea of conceptual combination, at least in the book that I'm working on this very subject. That's one of the main arguments, which is that, because people say, oh, if you're going to compose in historical styles, it's all been done before. Well, yeah, if you take a purely linear teleological perspective and you assume that there was Bach, therefore there was C.P. Bach, therefore there was J.C. Bach, therefore there was Mozart, therefore there was Beethoven. But that's a fantasy. That's not real. So one of the main arguments about this book is that J.S. Bach was largely forgotten, and they started to kind of rediscover him already in the late 18th century in very interesting ways. So that even someone like Beethoven could be read as not necessarily a direct successor to Mozart, but as a kind of going back to Bach while also being a successor to Mozart. So there's all of this is to say that there's so many opportunities for combining patterns and elements and styles that existed in the 18th century in new ways, creating new musics effectively, but in old styles. I completely anticipate that some people will simply not take it seriously because it was composed today. That said, I remember one of my professors, James Sepikoski, in a seminar at Yale asking, let's say you discovered that a sonata that was composed by Mozart was actually by Stravinsky. Would that lessen its value? And I had certain ideas back then, but now I have other ideas. Right now I would say Stravinsky wouldn't be able to do it. And I think that's the value. Being able to reconstruct something, like I said, that is effectively dead, because nobody's speaking like Mozart or Beethoven today. So there's value in the reconstruction. And then the reconstruction itself has its enormous implications regarding whether you call it nostalgia or identity, or it's part of this broader movement of people going back to the past to kind of, find some kind of meaning or something they don't see in today's world. I think the historically informed performance movement is all about this, effectively. Wanting to perform on old instruments, using old techniques. In context, yes, it just seems like they're trying to be historical, but at the same time, it's kind of trying to identify with something other than today. And there's value in that too. Taruskin, in his critiques of the HIP movement, he says its authenticity is not in really reconstructing how it was done, but the fact that they are trying to do this reconstruction. This is being authentically postmodern or what have you. So it's a different kind of authenticity. It's a thorny subject, to be sure. So it's not just about creativity, but creativity sort of mixed in with all these other things involving history and identity and culture.
Thanks again to Professor Buros for sharing his story with us today. You heard excerpts from two of his compositions, Fugue in B minor and Prelude in D minor. To find links to these and to read Dr. Buros' research, check out his website at vasilibyros.com. That's VASILIBYROS.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, stay creative.